Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each of our hearts be acceptable to you this day, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. When my seminary friend Samantha would tell this story, I always loved to hear it. She would share that when her daughter Lily was about 5 years old, Sam wanted to teach her about the Christmas story, and she used the nativity set as the tool to do so. As they set it up together, Sam asked Lily to name each of the characters. Now, Lily, being a PK, a pastor's kid, thought of church as her second home, and so she knew those characters. She knew who Jesus was and Mary. She recognized the shepherds and the wise men, the animals and the angels. But when Sam pointed to Joseph, Lily was stumped. Barn boy, she finally guessed. Poor Joseph. Nobody wants to be Joseph in the Christmas pageant. This quiet, unassuming carpenter is so easily forgotten. But the reality is this: Joseph plays a pivotal role in the birth story. His willingness to lean into the impossible and embrace the scandalous allows the miracle of the Christmas story to unfold. If we back up just a little bit and look closely at the part of the story that only Matthew's gospel includes, the part of the story that we often overlook when we focus on Luke's more full and compelling version, we find that Matthew is very quick to tell us that Joseph is a righteous man, someone who doesn't like to make waves or call attention to himself, a man devoted to God, honest and hardworking. Joseph enjoys an orderly life. But that life is shattered when he learns that his fiancée is pregnant. We need to understand that in first century life, engagement was not just a societal construct, but rather a legal contract. For all intents and purposes, Joseph and Mary were already a couple, already married. They just have not yet consummated the union. So Mary being pregnant means that she had to have been unfaithful. Joseph is faced, in this case, with only negative choices. If he announces her condition publicly, she's subject to stoning. If he divorces her quietly, she's left to go begging and to a life of prostitution in order to support herself and the baby. If he marries her, he's taking on a child who is not biologically his, a child that will then become his heir, and Joseph will be forced to live under this scandal for the rest of his days. Now, Matthew's brief passage doesn't share much about how Joseph felt with all of this happening around him, but we can only imagine how difficult this was. Here we have this hardworking, simple man who enjoys everything being just so, and now he's faced with shame and scandal. It's just a mess. But that kind of seems to be the way God works, doesn't it? Through all of these messy situations. In the passage immediately preceding the one that Larry just read for us, we hear Jesus' genealogy being laid out. A genealogy that includes people like Abraham, who abandoned his son and then endangered his wife not once but twice in order to save himself. We hear about Jacob, who tricked his older brother, and David, who slept with another man's wife and then had that man killed in order to have her for himself. There are women in the genealogy too, women like Rahab the prostitute. And now we come to this young woman and this young man whose reputations have been ruined by a helpless, homeless baby. Such a mess. And yet it's into this mess that God with us is born. It's against this backdrop that I find it so interesting that people in the church become so worried about being worthy and about getting everything right. I can't tell you how often people will come and say they're not sure they really can join the church. They're not sure they're worthy of God's love or acceptance. Breaks my heart when people tell me that, but it happens more often than you might think. But let's just take a giant step back for a moment, and instead of hearing this narrative as the sweet Christmas story that's softened by the glow of candles and twinkling lights, let's look more closely at it under the glare of daylight. And when we do, we see this in this story, as we do in so many in the Bible, people who are flawed, people who are living fragile existences. Kind of gives you a little bit of hope, doesn't it? Because if God can use these everyday people like Mary and Joseph for such a huge role as being parents to the Messiah, well then maybe, just maybe, God could also use us, could also redeem us. But just as we start to draw comfort from this idea, we need to look again, because what this righteous, faithful Joseph is being asked by an angel to do in his dream is to go beyond righteousness, to go beyond the law, to focus on something bigger, to lean into love, to raise the child as his own, to take Mary as his wife, to look out for the well-being of others. Or, as Barbara Brown Taylor says, Joseph is being asked to be willing to believe the impossible, to claim the scandal, to adopt it, and to give it his name, and to not only accept this whole mess, but to rock it tenderly, to sleep in his arms. What? What if God is asking the same of us? What then does it mean for us? If we recall, just in this past century, people like Gandhi and Oskar Schindler and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, all of these are people who risked prison, risked even death, to lean into love as they cared for others. Perhaps that means that rather than panic about the crisis that is unfolding today at the border, maybe we need to take a step back and lean into love and realize that as the wealthiest country in the world, we have the resources to welcome people who are fleeing violence and poverty. Maybe we shouldn't lock people up, but instead feed them and care for them as we lean into love and help them build peaceful lives for them and their families. Does that feel maybe like a little too much? I would challenge you to say it's not any more, it seems to me, than what God asked of Joseph. It's not any more than accepting scandal and giving a young baby who's not his own his name. Maybe we've overlooked an important aspect of this story in our retelling. Joseph is more than a barn boy. He's a critical part of the birth narrative who teaches us exactly what it means to live in God's realm, to move beyond what seems reasonable or at least possible, to lean into love for the sake of others. As we draw near to the birth of Emmanuel this week, my prayer is that we will respond to the angels around us and choose joy, choose love, choose the messiness into which God calls us for the sake of others. In this magical time of candlelight and twinkling lights, may we have the courage to look into the glare of God's blinding lights. Amen.